The night lay heavy upon the fields. A silence lingered, not the peaceful silence of sleep, but a suffocating silence, thick, suffused with fear, and broken only by the faint rattle of iron. Chains, always chains. The moonlight struggled to pierce through the mist of smoke rising from the overseer's fire. Shadows danced on the walls of the wooden quarters, where men, women, and children huddled together on the hard floor. Their bodies ached, their bellies burned with hunger, and their hearts carried the weight of despair. But in that silence, if you listened carefully, you could hear something else. A whisper, a hum, a trembling voice carrying an ancient rhythm. It was not a song sung for joy. It was a song of survival, a song that said, "We are still here." Samuel, barely 15, sat at the edge of the room. His wrists bore the raw red marks of shackles that had cut into his skin after a long day in the fields. He pressed his knees to his chest, resting his head against the wooden wall. The scars on his back, thick, uneven, and raised, itched with every movement, reminders of lashes that had long since dried but never healed. His eyes, though weary, did not sleep. He had not slept in months. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams always carried him back to that day, the day his mother was sold away. It had been 2 years ago. The master had arrived on horseback, his boots polished, his whip dangling lazily at his side. He had walked through the quarters, glancing at the women one by one, inspecting teeth, hands, and bodies as though they were cattle, when his gaze had fallen on Samuel's mother. A silence had swallowed the room. Her name was Ruth, strong, kind, and fiercely protective. She had clutched Samuel's hand as the master spoke numbers to another man, numbers Samuel could not yet understand. But he understood when her grip on his hand loosened, when she bent down and kissed his forehead, whispering through tears, "Be strong, my son. Be strong." The next moment, she was gone. Her figure fading into the dust, kicked up by the horses. Her voice still echoing in his ears. That was the last time Samuel saw her. His father had lasted only another year. Whispers of rebellion had reached the quarters, and Samuel's father had been among those accused of plotting an escape. They caught him. They whipped him until his back was nothing but torn flesh. And when he still refused to bow his head, they beat him to death before the others, leaving his body to rot in the fields. Samuel never forgot the way the overseer laughed as the life drained from his father's eyes. Now, in 1915, Samuel carried those memories like invisible chains. Every dawn was the same. The cracking of the overseer's whip shattered the night. The doors of the quarters flew open. Men and women staggered out into the cold air, their bodies bent, their steps slow but unwilling. The fields stretched endlessly. Cotton plants swayed in the wind, their white blossoms glistening in the early sun. To outsiders it might have looked beautiful, a sea of white under a golden sky. But to the slaves each plant was a thorn, each blossom a reminder of stolen lives. Samuel's hands were calloused, his nails cracked and blackened with dirt. He moved among the rows, plucking cotton with mechanical precision. Around him, the overseer's horse trotted back and forth, whip dangling, eyes sharp. Any slave who slowed, who faltered, who dared to straighten their back for too long, the whip would strike. Hours bled into hours. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, the sun blazed. Overhead, still they worked. They worked because they had no choice, and through it all they hummed. Low voices carrying secret songs. The overseers dismissed them as mindless mutterings. But the slaves knew otherwise. These were songs of memory, songs that told stories of Africa, of ancestors, of freedom that once was and might be again. Samuel's favorite was a song his mother used to hum. It carried no words, only a melody, soft, haunting, and steady like footsteps in the dark. When he hummed it under his breath, he felt her presence near, as if she was walking beside him. To the masters, songs were harmless. But to the slaves, songs were power. They were maps, prayers, codes. A verse about crossing the river might mean escape routes. A refrain about the eagle flying high might mean hope beyond death. And so they sang. They sang in whispers, in hums, in low tones that blended with the wind. They sang because silence was unbearable. They sang because it was the only way to remind themselves, we are more than chains, but hope was dangerous. And in 1915, the masters knew it. Punishments grew harsher, suspicions grew stronger. Whispers of rebellion were met with swift, merciless punishment. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the air turned golden, Samuel's friend Elias faltered. Elias was older, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders that once carried strength but now bent under exhaustion. His hands trembled as he picked the cotton, his breath ragged, the overseer noticed. "Stand straight, boy," he barked, though Elias was no boy. Elias tried. His body wavered, his knees gave way. He fell to the ground, clutching his chest. The overseer dismounted his horse, slowly, deliberately. He walked toward Elias, whip coiled in his hand. The other slaves froze, their eyes fixed on the ground. They knew what was coming. Samuel clenched his fists. He wanted to scream, to rush forward, to shield his friend, but he couldn't. None of them could. To move was to die. The whip cracked once, twice. The sound split the air, louder than thunder, sharper than bone-breaking. Elias cried out, his body jerking with each lash. Blood stained the white cotton around him. "Get up!" the overseer roared. But Elias did not move. His breath rattled once, twice, and then stopped. The overseer spat on the ground. Weak, worthless. He mounted his horse again, riding away as if nothing had happened. The slaves bent their heads lower, their hands moving faster, hiding tears behind sweat. Samuel's chest burned. Elias was gone. Another voice silenced. Another life erased. That night, Samuel could not hum. He could not sing. He sat in the corner of the quarters, his fists trembling, his jaw tight. Around him others wept silently. Elias had been their brother, their friend, their fellow sufferer. Now he was nothing more than another nameless grave, in the field. But Samuel remembered something his father once said. On a night long ago when the stars shone brighter than the whip cracked, they can break our backs. They can chain our hands, but they cannot chain the stories. As long as we remember we are not slaves, we are human. Samuel whispered those words to himself, over and over, until sleep finally claimed him. The morning after Elias's death, the fields felt different. The cotton plants swayed in the same wind, the overseer's whip cracked in the same rhythm, but something had shifted in the air. A heaviness clung to every breath. The slaves did not speak of it. They did not dare. But their silence was not emptiness. It was a silence thick with grief, thick with anger, thick with something that even the chains could not crush. Memory. Samuel bent over the plants, fingers working faster than his mind. Each thorn prick, each cut, each bruise, he let them sink into his skin without a sound. He had learned not to flinch, not to groan, not to let the overseer see weakness. But inside, the boy who had once dreamed of freedom now felt flames rising. The overseers thought Elias was gone, but Samuel carried him in his chest. Every beat of his heart was a drum saying, "Remember him, remember him." That night, after the overseers locked the quarters, after the sound of boots faded into distance, the whispers began. Old women leaned close, their voices like threads weaving stories together. Stories of Africa, of rivers wider than oceans, of drums louder than thunder. They spoke of ancestors who had been kings and queens before they were chained, of villages where children once laughed freely, of gods who still listened. The young ones listened. Samuel listened, his fists unclenched as he leaned into the words. These stories were their shield, their resistance. Every name remembered was a victory. Every memory spoken was a rebellion. An elder named Miriam spoke softly. "Elias will not be forgotten. His voice joins the others. Every time we sing, every time we whisper, he will rise again." Samuel closed his eyes. For the first time since Elias fell, he allowed himself a breath that did not taste of blood, but the masters knew that memory was dangerous. 2 days later, suspicion fell upon Miriam. The overseer claimed he had heard her leading songs at night, spreading unrest. And in the cruel logic of slavery, even the act of remembering was rebellion. They dragged her into the yard, binding her wrists to the post. The others were forced to watch. The sun was merciless. The whip cracked again and again, tearing into her flesh. She did not scream. She did not beg. With every strike, she whispered prayers. Her lips moved steadily, her voice barely audible, but Samuel heard. He heard her say the names of ancestors, the names of the dead, the names of the living who would not be broken. When she collapsed, unconscious and bloodied, they left her there. The slaves were ordered back to the fields. Samuel carried her whispers with him. They clung to his mind like fireflies in the dark, fragile, fleeting, but glowing. Glowing. That night, Samuel could not stay silent. He sat in the corner of the quarters, heart pounding. The faces around him were hollow, tired, beaten. But he felt something stirring. He remembered his father's words, Elias's fall, Miriam's whispers. He began to hum, softly, shakily at first, the melody of his mother's song. Heads turned, eyes widened. For a moment, fear filled the room. But then, one by one, voices joined in. A deep hum from the back, a high trembling note from the front. Soon the quarters filled with a harmony so soft, so secret, that it could have been mistaken for the wind. It was not just a song, it was a defiance, a reminder that though their bodies were chained, their spirits were not. Samuel's voice trembled, but it rose, and in that moment he was not just a boy, he was a keeper of memory, a voice among voices. As days bled into nights, Samuel began to dream of escape. Whispers in the quarters told of rivers that led north, of hidden paths through swamps, of stars that could guide the way. The North Stars are bright, steady, unyielding. It was said that freedom lay in its direction. But escape was no small dream. It was a death sentence if caught. Overseers had hounds, whips, and bullets. Stories circulated of those who tried. Bodies dragged back lifeless or worse, mutilated to serve as warnings. Still, Samuel's heart clung to the thought. He imagined walking under the stars, Elias at his side, Miriam's voice guiding him, his mother waiting at the end of the journey. Sometimes, hope is the most dangerous rebellion of all. One evening, the master himself arrived on the plantation. His carriage gleamed in the sunset, wheels caked with dust from other lands he owned. He stepped out, tall, sharp, eyes cold. The slaves were gathered in the yard, forced to kneel. The master inspected them as though he were surveying tools. He stopped before Samuel, tilting his chin upward with a gloved hand. Strong, he muttered. Young, worth a price. Fear raced through Samuel's veins. He knew what that meant. Sale, separation. The cruel rhythm of slavery, tearing families apart, scattering lives like seeds thrown to the wind. But before the master made his choice, his gaze shifted. He had heard whispers of singing, of voices, rising at night. He demanded to know who was guilty. No one spoke. Silence fell like a stone. The master's face twisted in rage. He ordered the overseer to choose one at random for punishment, to make an example. The whip fell on a young girl named Hannah. She had done nothing, said nothing, but her cries echoed across the fields. The message was clear. Silence would be broken with blood. Samuel's nails dug into his palms until they bled. Rage burned hotter than fear. The night Samuel made his vow, sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elias falling, Miriam's bloodied back, Hannah's tears. He heard the silence of the quarters, the silence that the whip had forced upon them. But within that silence, his vow beat louder than his heart. I will remember, I will resist. The morning came too soon. The overseer's boots thundered, the doors were flung open, and chains of exhaustion dragged the slaves into the fields once again. Samuel bent to the cotton, but this time he felt something different in his fingers. Not strength, not freedom, but purpose. Each thorn prick was no longer just pain, it was reminder. The overseer's lash struck the air, barking orders. Yet Samuel kept his vow buried inside him, hidden where no whip could reach. Days later, wagons rolled into the plantation. The master had returned, this time not just to survey but to sell. The slaves were lined up, inspected like livestock. Men with heavy purses arrived, traders, planters, strangers with cold eyes. They prodded arms, checked teeth, measured shoulders. Children were lifted like sacks. Samuel's stomach twisted as he watched Hannah pulled from her mother's arms. Her cry split the air as the buyer laughed, tossing coins into the master's hand. Her mother clawed, begged, screamed, until the butt of a rifle silenced her. The yard became a theater of despair, families torn apart in minutes, generations scattered as though they were nothing but broken pottery. Samuel wanted to close his eyes, but he forced himself to watch. Remember this, carry this. When his turn came, a trader examined him closely. Strong back, steady hands. The price was high, too high for the men who circled. The master waved them off. Samuel would remain at for now, but he knew what it meant. Any day, any hour he could be sold. His life, his memories, everything ripped away. Miriam, who had been whipped near death, slowly healed. Scars crossed her back like rivers carved into stone. She walked bent, but her voice remained unbroken. At night, when the overseers believed the slaves were too weary to move, she whispered still. Her words stitched the torn edges of hope. "They think pain silences us," she murmured one night. "But pain remembers. Pain carries the truth further than songs." Her words sank into Samuel's chest. He realized then, their survival itself was defiance. One dawn, Samuel and a group of others were ordered to load wagons for transport. Rumors spread quickly. Some were to be sent downriver. He helped push crates heavy with cotton, then chains, were clamped around wrists and ankles. Not for punishment, for shipment. The slaves were herded onto a flatboat. Samuel watched as they were forced below deck, crammed into darkness with barely room to breathe. The air reeked of sweat, blood, and fear. Though Samuel was spared this time, he stood on the bank as the boat drifted downriver. He saw hands reaching out from the slats of the hold, fingers clawing for sunlight, for air, for mercy. He knew many would not survive the journey, and even those who did would be lost forever, sold into strange plantations, vanished from memory. Samuel clenched his fists. If memory is all I have, then I will remember them too. That night, the quarters were restless. The slaves spoke in fragments, in codes, in songs that masked meaning beneath melody. "Follow the drinking gourd," one elder hummed, her voice raspy but sure. "The river will guide." Samuel leaned closer, listening. The words seemed ordinary, yet he heard the secret within. Songs were not just songs. They were maps, hints, instructions passed in plain sight. "Quilts, too," Miriam whispered. Stitched patterns hung on lines could mark safe paths. A star pattern might point north. A crooked line might mean danger ahead. The realization shook Samuel. There was an entire language hidden beneath the lashes of slavery, a language of survival, of escape. 1 week later, the overseers woke to find 2 beds empty. 2 young men, brothers, had vanished in the night. The hounds were released. The fields emptied as the search began. Samuel, forced to work, listened as the barking grew faint, then louder again. By evening, the brothers were dragged back, their clothes torn, their bodies bleeding from thorn and whip alike. The master ordered all slaves gathered. "This," he declared, pointing to their broken forms, "is what awaits those who dream of running." Before the crowd, he raised his pistol. A shot rang out. One brother fell lifeless. The other was beaten unconscious. The slaves wept in silence. Samuel's chest ached with fury. He wanted to scream, to throw himself at the master, to do anything but kneel. Yet he remained still, because he understood something in that moment. Resistance required patience. To act too soon was to be crushed. To endure was to prepare. That night, as the quarters mourned in silence, Samuel sat awake, the vow burning hotter. He saw the faces of those who had fallen: Elias, Hannah, Miriam, the brothers. Each loss was a chain added to his soul. But together, those chains forged something stronger than despair, not just survival, purpose. Samuel realized that freedom was not only about escape, it was about carrying their voices, refusing to let them vanish. Even if he died, if his voice carried theirs forward, then chains would not win. And so, as the others slept, Samuel began to whisper. Not to anyone, not for anyone, but to the darkness itself. I remember. His whisper grew steady. I carry Elias. I carry Miriam. I carry Hannah. I carry the brothers. The words became rhythm, a secret prayer, a hidden rebellion, and in that moment Samuel knew his story had only just begun. Morning broke with grey skies and the weight of silence. The overseer stormed through the quarters, barking orders, but Samuel's mind was elsewhere. Inside him a fire smouldered, not of rage alone, but of something deeper. Every lash he had seen, every tear shed, every prayer whispered, it was all kindling. The overseers thought they had crushed the spirit of the slaves. They had not. They had only buried embers waiting for breath. Samuel felt those embers glow within him. That night Miriam called Samuel aside. Her voice was barely audible, cracked by scars on her throat. "You listen well," she rasped. "Not all chains are iron. The mind can be free before the body." Samuel nodded, though he did not fully understand. Miriam continued, "There are safe places far north, people who despise the master's whip. They help the runaways, hide them, feed them, guide them. They call it the underground." The word felt heavy, alive. Samuel whispered it back. "Underground." Miriam's eyes glistened. "Not a tunnel of dirt, a tunnel of people. Every step is risk, but every step is hope." Samuel trembled. The thought of escape had always been shadow, but now it had a shape. The next day the slaves were gathered once more. This time not for a sale, but for punishment. One man had dared to speak back to the overseer. His words were simple. "We are men, not cattle." For that he was dragged into the yard. A fire roared in an iron barrel. From it, a branding iron was pulled, glowing red like the sun itself. Samuel was forced to watch as the iron pressed against the man's shoulder. The hiss of flesh burning filled the air. The man's scream seemed endless, echoing into the fields. The master declared, "This mark will remind him what he is, property." Samuel clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. The smell of charred skin would never leave him, but within the horror his vow deepened. "If memory is all I can carry, then I will carry even this." That night, when the pain of the branding still hung in the air, an elder lifted her trembling voice in song. It was soft at first, but soon others joined. The words told of rivers, of stars, of Jordan and Canaan. To the masters it was just a hymn, to the slaves it was a code. Steal away home." Samuel listened, and he felt the message wrap around him like a cloak. The songs were not just laments. They were instructions. Hope disguised in melody. Each note carried more than sound. It carried direction. It carried defiance. And Samuel sang too, his voice joining the hidden map of freedom. But freedom was never sung without cost. The overseer, drunk and furious one night, stormed into the quarters. He accused them of idleness, of insolence. His whip cracked across backs indiscriminately, lashing men, women, children. When he reached Miriam, Samuel stepped forward without thinking. The whip sliced across his shoulder, but he did not cry out. He stood tall, his eyes locked on the overseer's. For a brief moment, silence fell. The overseer stared at Samuel, whip in hand, uncertain. Then, with a sneer, he struck again, harder, and left him bleeding in the dirt. But Samuel had not lowered his gaze. That silent defiance spread through the quarters like lightning. They saw him stand. They saw him endure. And they understood. Even without weapons, even without freedom, resistance was possible. That night Samuel dreamed of Hannah. She stood in the fields, not in rags, but in white cloth, her face calm. "You remember me," she said. Samuel reached for her, but she shook her head. "No, you carry me, that is enough." He woke with tears on his cheeks. The dream felt more real than the world around him, and with it came a deeper certainty. Memory itself was a weapon. Weeks later, rumors spread again. A man from another plantation had fled and survived. Whispers said he had reached the north, that he now breathed air without chains. The overseers dismissed it as lies, but the slaves knew better. Hope does not spread without root. Miriam pulled Samuel aside. "The path is dangerous. Most die, but some live. The choice will come to you." Samuel's heart pounded. He had dreamed of freedom, but now it was more than dream. It was possibility. One sweltering day, as Samuel picked in the fields, a boy beside him collapsed from heat. The overseer struck him to his feet. When he could not rise, the whip fell again and again until the boy lay still. The overseer ordered Samuel and 2 others to drag the body away. As Samuel lifted the limp weight, something inside him snapped. He wanted to scream, to tear the overseer apart with his bare hands, but instead he whispered to the boy's still face, "I carry you." It was all he could offer, but it was enough to keep the fire burning. That night Samuel gathered courage. He whispered to those nearest him in the quarters, "We are more than chains, more than whips. They cannot own our memory, they cannot own our songs, they cannot own our hope." Eyes widened in the dark. Fear was there, but so was something else, a flicker of belief. Miriam nodded, her scarred back straightening as much as it could. "Then let us carry one another." And so the vow spread, not Samuel's alone now, but shared. A vow to endure, to resist, to remember. The quarters at night were no longer the same. Once the silence had been heavy with despair, a silence that crushed every voice before it could rise. Now that silence carried something different. It carried secrets. Samuel felt it in the way eyes lingered longer, in the way hands brushed against one another with small signals, in the way songs swelled softly after sundown. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it had begun to take root like weeds pushing through stone. The overseer had not yet noticed, but Samuel knew. The more their spirits rose, the closer danger crept. One evening, when the sun had dipped behind the trees, the overseer gathered them in the yard. His face was dark with suspicion. "Too many whispers," he spat. "Too many eyes that don't stay down." He ordered 2 men forward. They were whipped until their backs split open, blood soaking into the dust. Then he snarled, "Let this remind you, silence is survival. Speak and you'll bleed." The slaves bowed their heads, but Samuel did not forget. He saw fear sweep over them like a storm, yet beneath the fear, he also saw something else. The lash could tear flesh, but it could not erase memory. The overseer's footsteps faded. An elder leaned close and whispered, "Fear teaches us what not to do, but courage teaches us what we must." That same night, the elder, her name was Abina, began to tell a story. Her voice was raspy, but her words painted vivid pictures. "Long ago," she said, "we were not slaves, we were kings and queens, farmers and hunters, mothers and fathers. We walked free under the wide African skies. We had names they could never pronounce, songs they could never steal, gods they could never know." The children leaned forward, wide-eyed. Even the adults listened as though they had been starved for this nourishment. "They take our bodies," Abina whispered, "but they cannot take our past. As long as you remember where you came from, you are not only what they call you, you are more." For Samuel, the words were a revelation. He had never seen Africa, never breathed its air. But through Abina's stories he felt it stirring inside him, as though a forgotten inheritance had been returned. Days later, the overseer dragged a man into the yard, shackled, bloodied, half dead. He had tried to flee. The slaves were forced to watch as he was chained to a post. The master declared, "This is what happens to runaways. Let it burn into your memory." The man's back was scourged until it was nothing but torn flesh. His cries echoed across the fields. Then he was left in the dirt, discarded like broken wood. Samuel's stomach turned, but his heart did not break. Instead, he looked closer. In the man's torn shirt, he saw a scrap of cloth, marked with strange lines, a map, a code. Samuel did not know. But he understood this much. The man had not fled blindly. Someone had guided him, and if one could try, so could others. In the days that followed, Samuel found himself speaking more. At night, in the shadows of the quarters, he repeated Abina's stories. He whispered the songs Miriam had taught him. He reminded them of the vow, "We are more than chains." At first his voice trembled. He was no leader, just another scarred back in the field. But when others nodded, when children's eyes shone, when Miriam placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Your words carry weight," Samuel began to believe. Leadership was not something given. It was something carried, like a burden passed hand to hand. The sky itself seemed to sense what stirred among them. Dark clouds rolled in one evening, thunder rumbling like distant drums. The slaves worked in the fields under the shadow of the storm, overseers shouting to hurry before the rain came. The air was thick, electric, heavy with the promise of release. When the first drops fell, Samuel lifted his face to the sky. The cool water ran down his cheeks, mixing with sweat and blood. Around him, others did the same. For a moment, the whip was forgotten, the master's voice drowned by the roar of rain. Nature itself seemed to wash over them, a reminder that no chain was stronger than the storm. And in that storm, Samuel whispered to himself, "The time is coming." The fields were soaked. The soil clung to bare feet, heavy and thick. Overseers cursed, swinging whips not only at bodies but at the mud itself, as if punishing the land for daring to resist. But Samuel walked differently. His steps were heavy, yes, but his mind was light. The storm had whispered to him. It had said, "The chains are not forever." When Miriam caught his gaze, she saw it too, a fire that would not be drowned by rain. Food was scarce, as always. A handful of cornmeal, a scrap of meat, sometimes nothing at all. Yet the hunger in Samuel's belly no longer felt like the greatest hunger. It was the hunger for freedom that gnawed sharper. At night, Abena told more stories. She spoke of rivers that carried traders, of drums that spoke across villages, of dances that turned sorrow into strength. One boy asked, "Why do you tell us this?" "It only makes me hurt more." Abena smiled softly. "Because pain can chain you, or it can sharpen you. If you know who you were, you'll never believe the lie of what they call you now." The overseer's eyes grew sharper in those days. He noticed the way slaves sometimes glanced at one another too long. He heard the way songs carried strange rhythms. One evening, he stormed into the quarters, dragging his lantern. "You think I don't see," he growled. "You think I don't. Here?" He struck a man at random, his whip cracking against skin. The slaves froze, silent as stone. Samuel clenched his fists in the shadows. He wanted to speak, to shout, but he knew silence was the only shield. Not yet, he thought. Not yet. Late that night, Samuel crept to the corner where the runaways shirt scrap had been hidden. In the faint moonlight, he studied the lines again. They were not random. They marked directions. Rivers, roads, trees. Miriam leaned close. "Do you know what it means?" "Not yet," Samuel whispered. "But someone must have known. Someone who dared to guide." Miriam's eyes shone. "Then maybe we can learn." Too. For the first time, Samuel felt not just hope, but purpose. The next day, as they worked in the fields, a woman began to sing. Her voice rose, soft but steady. "Steal away, steal away." The overseer barked, "Quiet!" But another voice joined. Then another. The song spread, weaving through the rows like wind through grass. The whip cracked, silencing some, but not all. The melody lived on, a defiance too subtle to be punished, too strong to be crushed. Samuel sang too. His voice shook, but it carried. And in that song, he felt them all breathing together as one. Days later, the man who had been punished for fleeing finally died. His body was buried in the woods, unmarked, unremembered by the masters. But among the slaves, he was remembered. Samuel whispered his name in the dark, teaching the children. Abena added his story to her tales. They wanted him forgotten, Samuel said, but we will not forget. His pain is our lesson. His courage is our guide. And as they whispered, Samuel passed the cloth scrap from hand to hand. Each one touched it, as though it carried more than lines, as though it carried the man's spirit. Leadership pressed heavy on Samuel. He had not asked for it, yet it had settled on his shoulders like an iron yoke. At night, when others slept, he lay awake. What if the overseer discovered their whispers? What if his words led to blood? But then he remembered the storm, the songs, the map, the vow. If I stay silent, he thought, then the chains win. If I speak, perhaps we suffer, but perhaps we live. Miriam, sensing his unrest, told him, "A voice is a weapon. They fear your words more than your strength. That is why you must keep speaking." And Samuel knew she was right. One night, as the fire in the quarters burned low, Samuel stood and looked at them all. The children curled against their mothers, the men broken but still breathing, the women whose eyes still glowed with endurance. He saw not slaves but a people, a people bound but not erased, a people wounded but not defeated. And in that firelight, Samuel vowed again, not only to himself, but aloud, they will not silence us. They will not end us. We will live. We will remember. And one day we will be free. The words settled over them like a blessing, like armor. The quarters, once only a prison of sleep, became that night a sanctuary of hope. The morning sun rose, but it brought no warmth. The overseer's mood had shifted, sharper, crueler. He sensed something stirring among the slaves. He did not know the words whispered in the dark, nor the fire growing inside them, but he felt it. And fear, for men like him, turned to violence. Whips cracked sooner. Punishments grew harsher. The smallest mistake became reason enough for blood. Yet Samuel noticed something strange. With each lash, each shout, each cruelty, their unity only grew. Fear was no longer the master's weapon alone. It became the forge where their courage was tempered. One afternoon, while working in the fields, Miriam stumbled. The overseer lifted his whip, ready to strike. Samuel's heart clenched, but before the lash fell, Miriam looked up. Her gaze did not plead, it defied. Do it. Her eyes seemed to say. But you cannot break me. The overseer hesitated just long enough for the moment to matter. When the whip finally came down, it tore her skin, but not her spirit. And everyone saw that night. Samuel tended her wounds with trembling hands. You should not have looked at him like that, he whispered. I should, Miriam answered, her voice calm even through pain. Because he must know we are not shadows. We are human, and one day we will rise. Her courage lit Samuel's resolve brighter than any flame. The secret map, passed from hand to hand, grew clearer. Elders traced its lines, adding memories of rivers, roads, hidden places. It became more than cloth. It became a dream stitched into fabric, and with it the songs grew louder. Children hummed melodies that overseers mistook for nonsense. Women sewed patterns into quilts that only the slaves could read. Men exchanged glances that carried whole sentences. It was not rebellion yet, but it was the seed of one. The overseer grew restless. He suspected but did not know. So he chose to strike terror where it would hurt most. One night, without warning, he dragged a young boy from the quarters, barely 12. He accused him of stealing, though the boy had taken nothing but a piece of bread. Before everyone's eyes, he lashed the boy until he collapsed. Samuel felt something inside him break. The boy's cries echoed long after his voice was gone. And, when silence fell, it was not submission that filled the quarters. It was fury. They could not scream, they could not fight. But in their hearts, something sharpened into steel. That night, Samuel could not sleep. He sat by the dying fire, staring at the embers. The others looked to him now, not openly but in every glance, every silence. He was no longer only a man. He had become their unspoken voice. But voices carried danger. To speak meant to risk. All Miriam came to him quietly. You cannot carry this alone, she said. Samuel shook his head. If I lead them, they may die. If you do not, Miriam replied, they will die anyway, as with no name, no memory, no dream. Which death would you choose? Samuel closed his eyes. The fire popped. And in that moment, he chose. Next night, for the first time, the slaves gathered not only to rest, but to listen. Samuel stood, his hands trembling, his voice low. I am no master, no preacher. I have no book, no crown, but I know this. We are more than they say we are. We are not cattle. We are not shadows. We are a people, and a people can never be chained forever. Faces lifted, eyes glistened. For some, it was the first time they had ever heard such words. Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger. They think they own us, but they cannot own our memory, they cannot own our hope, and they will never own our future. A murmur rose, soft but steady. Agreement, belief in. That moment, the quarters transformed. It was no longer a cage of silence. It was a birthplace of resistance. But outside, unseen in the shadows, the overseer watched. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. He had seen the gathering. He had heard just enough, and he knew something dangerous was rising in his fields. The eye. Next dawn the whip would strike harder than ever, but Samuel did not fear. For the first time he felt ready. Morning came cruel. The sun had barely broken the horizon when the overseer stormed into the quarters, whip coiled in his hand like a venomous serpent. His boots struck the ground with a rhythm that froze hearts. "Up!" he barked. "All of you." The slaves stumbled. From their bunks, bodies weary, spirits heavy. But beneath their silence a spark burned. The overseer's gaze swept over them until it landed on Samuel. For a moment he said nothing. Then, with deliberate slowness, he uncoiled the whip. "You think I don't see?" His voice dripped with venom. "You think I don't know?" The lash cracked through the air, striking the dirt inches from Samuel's feet. One word, one whisper, and I'll make an example of you all. The silence that followed was suffocating. But Samuel did not bow. His eyes met the overseer's, steady, unbroken, and in that silent defiance, a war had begun. The overseer sought to crush them. Work hours stretched longer. Food rations shrank smaller. Punishments rained like storms. He dragged men into the fields and lashed them for imagined mistakes. He forced women to carry loads heavier than their frail bodies could bear. He mocked their songs, ripped their quilts, tore apart anything that smelled of unity. But still the fire refused to die. Samuel whispered words of strength while picking cotton. Miriam hummed tunes of freedom even when her throat burned dry. Elders repeated stories of Africa, of a homeland that still lived within them. Every cruelty became another thread binding them together. One night, after the overseer's rage had left fresh wounds on their backs, Samuel spoke again. His voice was hoarse, but it carried the weight of prophecy. "They think pain will end us," he said, "but pain is the proof that we still live. And if we live, we will rise." He looked at every face in the flickering firelight. "Swear, with me. Swear that no matter what they do, we will remember. We will endure. We will pass on our names, our stories, our hope." One by one, voices answered. Some weak, some strong, but all unbroken. It was a vow that could not be whipped away. But hope is never safe. Among the slaves was one who feared death more than chains. His name was Josiah, a man worn by suffering, desperate to survive. At any cost, the overseer saw his weakness and twisted it into a weapon. Promises of lighter work, extra food, the illusion of safety. All Josiah had to do was listen, and so he did. When Samuel spoke of escape, Josiah carried the whispers to the master's ear. When quilts carried hidden paths, Josiah pointed them out. When songs were sung in secret, Josiah translated their meanings. The chain of unity cracked from within. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the overseer dragged Samuel before the others. His face was twisted with triumph. "You think you're clever?" he sneered. "You think I don't?" "No?" He raised the whip. The lash tore across Samuel's back, flesh opening, blood spilling. Again and again. Each strike echoed like thunder, but Samuel did not scream. He bit down his cries until his mouth filled with the taste of iron. The slaves watched in agony, powerless. The overseer wanted to show them that defiance had a price, but what he showed them instead was that Samuel's spirit could not be broken. When Samuel collapsed, the overseer laughed. "This is what happens to leaders." But before he could walk away, Miriam stepped forward, her face pale, her body trembling, but her eyes fierce. "You can break his skin," she said, voice sharp as steel, "but you will never break his soul." The overseer turned, fury burning in his eyes. He raised his hand to strike her, but in that instant something shifted. Dozens of slaves stepped forward, not openly, but just enough. Their presence was a wall. The overseer froze. For the first time he felt it, not fear of rebellion, fear of them. That night, Samuel lay broken in the quarters. Miriam tended his wounds, tears tracing her cheeks. "You should not have spoken," Samuel whispered weakly. "I had to," Miriam replied, "because your strength is ours, and ours is yours." In his pain, Samuel smiled faintly. He understood now. He was not their savior. They were each other's salvation. The overseer, rattled by what he had seen, grew desperate. He pressed Josiah harder, demanding names, demanding proof, but Josiah faltered. Guilt gnawed at him. For every betrayal he saw Samuel's blood. For every secret sold, he saw Miriam's eyes. In the end, Josiah could not bear the weight, and so in a broken whisper, he confessed to Samuel. I told him everything. Forgive me. Samuel's gaze held no hate, only sorrow. The chains broke you, brother, but you are still one of us. The words struck deeper than any whip, and in that moment Josiah chose. He would not betray again. The days that followed grew tense. The overseer's cruelty reached its peak, but so did the slaves' quiet resistance. Songs grew louder. Quilts carried bolder maps. Glances became plans, and Samuel, though scarred, stood once more. The time is near, he whispered. We cannot wait forever. The fire in their hearts was no longer hidden. It was a storm waiting to break. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain. Thunder rolled in the distance, as if the heavens themselves prepared to bear witness to what was about to unfold. Inside the dim slave quarters, silence fell. Not the silence of fear, but the silence before a storm. Samuel stood, his back scarred, his body weakened, yet his voice strong. Tonight, he whispered, we choose, not whether we live or die, but whether we bow or rise. Miriam's eyes glistened in the firelight. If we fail, Samuel met her gaze, then let them know we tried. Let them know we were more than hands in their fields. We were human, and humans do not stay silent forever. Around him, the slaves nodded. Elders, children, mothers, men, all carried the same fire, a vow older than chains. The plan was desperate. A storm was coming. Under its cover, they would slip into the night, following the path stitched into hidden quilts guided by songs that told of rivers, swamps, and stars. Some would carry torches, others would carry nothing but hope. Josiah, once the betrayer, now swore to lead the first group. His guilt demanded redemption. Samuel clasped his hand, forgiving him not with words, but with trust. The overseer, drunk from the day's labor, slept heavy in his quarters. The hounds lay chained, unaware of the storm. It was the hour of decision. The sky broke open with lightning. Rain poured, drumming on rooftops, masking the sound of footsteps. One by one the slaves slipped into the night. Bare feet sank into the mud, but their hearts soared. For the first time, the chains felt lighter. Miriam carried a child close to, her chest whispering lullabies of courage. Samuel walked at the front, guiding them by the North Star whenever it peeked through the storm clouds. The songs of Africa hummed beneath their breaths, not loud, not daring, but steady. A heartbeat in the dark. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was in the air, in the rain, in every step they took. But freedom is never given easily. The overseer woke to the sound of the storm and the absence of silence. The quarters were half empty. His fury exploded like fire. "Up the dogs!" he roared. Torches lit the night. The hounds, unleashed, howled through the fields. The hunters followed, muskets loaded, whips ready. The chase had begun. The storm turned the fields into rivers of mud. The slaves ran, slipping, clutching each other, refusing to let go. Gunshots cracked the air. Screams followed. A mother fell, shielding her child. A young boy stumbled, never to rise again. Josiah turned, torch in hand, blocking the path of the overseer's men. His voice rang out over the storm. "You'll not take them all." The flames lit his face for the last time before musket fire silenced him. His sacrifice bought them moments, moments that meant everything. Samuel pulled Miriam forward, his strength waning but his will unbroken. "We keep going," he gasped, "for them, for all of them." At last they reached the river. Its waters raged with the storm, but to them it was no enemy. It was a passage. Some hesitated, fear in their eyes. Samuel stepped into the current, waves lashing against him. "Better to die in the river of freedom," he cried, "than live in the fields of chains." One by one they followed. Mothers clutched their children. Men locked arms to keep from being swept away. Miriam stumbled, the child slipping from her grasp, but Samuel dove, dragging them both to the far bank. His body bled, his strength fading, but his spirit carried them through. Not all made it. Torches lit the opposite bank as overseers caught the trailing group. The screams of the captured echoed across the river, tearing into the hearts of those who escaped. Samuel looked back, pain in his eyes, but Miriam touched his shoulder. If we turn, we lose them all. We must live to tell. The hardest choice was to keep walking. Days later, bruised and starving, the survivors stumbled into a swampy thicket where the overseer's reach could not easily follow. There, hidden from the world, they rested. Elders prayed, children wept, and Samuel, barely alive, whispered words that would outlive him. They thought us cattle, they thought us shadows, but tonight we proved them wrong. Remember this night, tell it, sing it, sew it into cloth, carve it into wood, so when the chains fall, and they will fall, the world will know we were never silent. His voice broke, but the fire in it burned eternal. The fever took him 2 nights later. Miriam held his hand as his final breath left him. "You carried us," she whispered, tears falling. "And we will carry you." They buried him beneath a tree, marking the spot with stones in the shape of a star. Above, the storm had passed, the sky was clear, and in the stillness it seemed as if the land itself had paused to remember. Years turned to decades. Some who escaped that night lived to see freedom declared. Others did not, but their children carried the songs, their quilts carried the maps, their stories carried the fire, and Samuel's name, whispered, sung, remembered, became a legend. They were no longer nameless, no longer faceless, no longer forgotten. The world tried to bury their voices in silence, but silence could not hold them. Their whispers became stories, their stories became memory, and memory became power. And so, when we speak of the slaves, those bound in chains, beaten, broken, we must also speak of the unbroken spirit that endured, because they were more than victims, they were dreamers, they were warriors. They were the forgotten voices of 1915, voices that even in chains sang of freedom. And still, if you listen closely in the winds of the fields, you can hear them, not in screams, not in sorrow, but in defiance. A chorus of the enslaved, whispering, across centuries we were here, we endured, and we will never be forgotten.